Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking, and grab your deerstalker hats and weird trench coats because this week I'm looking at the Great Ace Attorney 2 Resolve, released in Japan in 2017 and worldwide in 2021. Development began shortly after the first game and was created to serve as a part 2 to Adventures as opposed to a standalone sequel with its own contained story. I tried to skip over any spoilers in my review of Adventures, but that's not even going to be remotely possible here, so if you just want my general thoughts on the game, skip to here. Is this part 2 a departure from the quality of the first, or does it pull into the same port of success? Let's find out as we give it everything we've got! Chapter 1: The Adventure of the Blossoming Attorney! The game opens not with our favorite ancestor, but our favorite ancestor's assistant, Susato Mikotoba, having returned to Japan at the end of the first game to take care of her sick father. She's visiting the grave of Kazuma Asogi, Ryonosuke's friend who jobbed out to a fucking shove. She says some patented Mikotoba chicanery has led to her stepping into a Japanese court as a lawyer, having to defend her friend Rei Membami, a name that's always hard to remember for me. However, women aren't allowed in Japanese courtrooms, so she has to wear a disguise and go under the fake name her father chose for her, Ryutaro Naruhodo. Rei is accused of murdering this woman, Giselle Brett. Miss Brett is important. She is the one who murdered John Wilson at the beginning of the first game. What goes around comes around, I guess. However, she wasn't sent to prison. As a visiting English woman, she was scheduled to be expedited to another country but died on the beach. The two witnesses that remember Rei Membami being at the scene are two familiar faces, Inspector Hosonaga and Sosuke Natsume. Hosonaga was an important part of the first chapters in the first game, and Natsume was the defendant of the worst chapter of the first game. I'm just so happy to see him again. Susato, Ryutaro, copies Ryonosuke's techniques and mannerisms and manages to deduce the identity of an anonymous source that submitted a seemingly incriminating photo, and the court takes a recess to bring him in. The faceless photographer is Wright in Many Memo, which is exactly what I do when preparing to make these reviews. Susataro eventually figures out that Many Memo is the culprit behind Miss Brett's murder, having used a fountain pen to steal poison from her father's lab and pouring it in her glass during an attempted interview. He then stabbed her in the back to confuse people, leading to Rei becoming the prime suspect. After being fucking yeeted across the courtroom, he explains that he originally stole the poison to write an article on it and never had any intention of killing anyone. But his anger towards Miss Brett essentially getting away with murder and insulting him to his face drove him over the edge.
The fuck you say to me, you little shit?
Before Rei is declared innocent, he mentions that a secretive deal must have gone down between England and Japan that led to her safety. I'm sure that won't be important. I mean, this guy also said that Kazuma died, never made it to England, and that his body was never recovered. Crazy, right? Thankfully, he gets fucked across the room again, this time by the judge. Natsume then talks about the second case he was involved in while in England, and it's revealed that something about that case made Ryusato's father call her back to Japan. She sends a letter to Ryonosuke with all of this information as Chapter 1 comes to a close. Much like the first chapter from the first game, this is the shortest and easiest one. The trial is the entire chapter and it's only in 2 parts. Playing as Susato was a fun twist on things, and having the first culprit be the first victim was a strong way to start the game. But both Natsume and Many Memo brought the trial down with their tendencies to be almost unbearably annoying just all of the time. But Susato's note carries us straight into Chapter 2! The Memoirs of the Clouded Kokoro! Now we finally reconnect with Ryonosuke Naruhodo, months after being barred from practicing law after leaking government secrets in a public trial.
Do you have anything to say for yourself?
I'm sorry, I'm just such a Scorpio, you know?
After receiving Susato's note, he decides to reread the case notes of the case she's talking about, and we flash back in time where a majority of this chapter takes place. I immediately didn't like this, as it seemed like a retroactive addition to make things fit together better later on. And the argument that they don't show every case they work on in the games, just the important ones, doesn't make sense either, since this case is much more important than the one we actually got. Taking place directly after Natsume's trial, the trio of Ryonosuke, Susato, and Herlock Sholmes visit the recently awoken Miss Green, who's looking pretty blue. They are then called right back to Natsume's apartment complex to investigate the murder of this man, William Shamspear. You don't know how much I wish I was joking. Shamspear actually has a very small appearance in the first game, although it's only in one scene that isn't at all important to the story and really didn't need to be there. Anyway, we reunite with Inspector Gregson at the scene. Even though the characters just saw him yesterday, he mentions that Shamspear was a poor man that had recently been arrested for fraud, and that Natsume is the main suspect, having been the last person to see him alive. Ryonosuke and Susato's investigation leads them to discover a torn piece of an envelope, 2 teacups, one of which is believed to be poisoned, soap bars in the holes of a bricked up window with a strange red circle in them, and a glass meter where you insert a certain amount of coins for 2 hours of gas.
Man, 1910 times were weird.
Shamspear then stands up like he wasn't just thought to be dead, quotes Macbeth, and passes the f**k out. Just wait until he sees the tea stain on that table. An interrogation with Natsume reveals that his apartment is thought to be cursed by the soul of the man who died in it, and has had nightmares of being strangled by said ghost. Gregson then provides an update on Shamspear, saying he's accused Natsume of being the one to kill him. Well, that's great. Trial time! Now's a good time to mention a huge omission from my previous review. The Reaper of the Bailey, Barak von Zeeks. He's the prosecutor you go against most of the time, and he's very casually racist against all Japanese people.
Whatever floats your boat, man. Or sinks it.
He's known as the Reaper because any guilty individual that has managed to escape conviction with Van Zeeks as the prosecutor has mysteriously died shortly afterwards. After Ryonosuke proves that there's no way to establish definitively that Natsume poisoned Shamspear, since the poison activates in half an hour and he didn't ingest the poison until 2.5 hours after Natsume left, Willie himself arrives to the courtroom with another man, Adron B. Meterman, a meterman for the Altamont Gas Company looking into Shamspear. All of the jurors fall in love with Shamspear's sham and declare Natsume guilty, but a quick summation examination reveals that Shamspear was being investigated as a potential gas thief, which establishes reasonable doubt in his testimony. You soon find out Shamspear's scam here. He created depressions in soap exactly the same size as the coins used on the gas meter, filling them with water and freezing them. He would then insert them into the meter. He would get the gas, which would melt the ice in the process. However, since the water pipes were frozen, he had to use Natsume's tea. With a bunch of new shit to investigate and the victim's image in tatters, the trial is put on hold. Investigating Willie Sham's apartment with Herlock's invention that allows you to see fingerprints leads to the discovery of a hole in the floor containing an article about an old convicted burglar, an empty box, and a picture of the landlady with Miss Green's deceased loved one. There's also a bunch of prints on that part of the wall, seemingly for no reason. The convict, Selden, is the spirit rumored to be haunting the apartment complex, as he used to live there and killed the next tenant via carbon monoxide poisoning, Duncan Ross. Ross is the other guy in the picture and Miss Green's deceased fiance. They stop Miss Green from game-ending herself via poison, and the trial resumes shortly afterwards. In it, you find out what really happened to Mr. Shamspear, and shockingly, he's not an innocent victim. He was the one who killed Duncan Ross and attempted to kill Natsume. By blowing into the gas pipe, he cut off the gas flow temporarily, which led to a gas leak. Miss Green found out what happened and put poison around the pipe to kill him, and the reason Shamspear was doing all this was in an attempt to get into Selden's former apartment where he hid his fortune. When Shamspear was in jail, Selden was his Selden mate. Both Green and Shamspear are arrested, and Selden's fortune is found to be a bloody dog collar with a massive bee on it. And the report of this case is what compels Susato's father to fake an illness so she'll return to Japan. As is the trend with Natsume, this is the worst chapter in the game. While Chapter 1 is a mostly detached tutorial, this is an unnecessary flashback to add a few small details that are either unnecessary or could have been added in another chapter in the present day. It especially stands out since Chapters 3 through 5 tell one long story. So let's quit talking about this show and move right along into Chapter 3, The Return of the Great Departed Soul. Back in present day, the chapter begins at London's Grand Exhibition, a showcase of all that advanced early 20th century technology like light bulbs and phonographs. This perm-having scientist is Albert Harebrain, and his plan is to teleport his subject. There's a word for rash and ill-judged plans like that, but the word escapes me. And since it's the early 20th century and not the early 30th century, his experiment goes as well as you'd expect. We pick up with Ryonosuke as he and Iris visit Lord Chief Justice Male Strongheart in an attempt to be allowed back into court. It's at this moment I'd like to bring attention to the 3 bonus costumes you have the choice to use in this game.
Muy bien. Muy bien.
I mention them now since this is when I started using Ryonosuke's. Anyway, we find out that Hairbrain has been arrested for the murder of his subject, rich businessman and investor Mr. Odie Asman! What do you mean it's Asman? Despite the fact that teleportation isn't possible, Asman's body somehow got from the device to the intended location just a bit too high. His body crashed down and he was supposedly killed on impact. Oh, and no big deal, but Asman was the leader of a crime syndicate and was recently acquitted after bribing the jury. After meeting with Hairbrain and later being introduced to Van Ziek's new masked apprentice, which if that isn't the name of a reality show, it will be soon, and I'm sure he's not wearing a mask because he's someone we've met before and would be surprised to see alive. That would just be obvious. Anyway, Runo and Iris make their way to the Grand Exhibition, where we witness the Grand Lest Return. Gregson has taken Gina under his wing because everyone's getting an apprentice now, effectively making her Detective Inspector Lestrade. The Sherlock fan in me is happy, and the Gina fan in me is happy. It's a good day. Ignore that someone died. Unable to investigate the teleporter itself thanks to the special provision for the protection of science and technology, they investigate the surrounding area and find a large burn mark, a piece of a balloon, and a crossbow. After Iris casually commits a crime by bribing a police officer and a screwdriver is found at the scene, Runo heads off to a wax museum that Herlock is investigating, where he meets Madame Tuspels, a master waxworker from a long line of waxworkers specializing in criminals. Herlock is investigating the theft and ransom of one of the exhibit's wax figures, the Professor, the most notorious murderer in England's history. The Professor is a reference to Professor Moriarty. This professor murdered 5 of England's elite 10 years ago with help from a large dog, the final victim being Beric Van Ziek's brother, Clint. But since wax statues are only made of dead people here, we sadly won't be having any interactions with him. Or maybe we already have. But there is no time to debate what is, was, or may be. It's trial o'clock. The prosecution's position is that the teleportation actually worked, and that Hairbrain intentionally teleported 30 feet too high so he'd fall and break his neck. When his bloody screwdriver is presented, Van Zieks then believes he stabbed Asman before the teleportation. Hairbrain objects, saying he had no reason to kill his top financial backer, and that metal can't be teleported. Runo provides reasonable doubt the teleportation occurred by pointing out that the victim's metal glasses were on his corpse, so if the teleportation actually happened, the screwdriver would have gone through too. With the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, balloon salesman and hot air balloon operator Balthazar Loon, and professional spoiled bohemian brat Wilhelm Gottsreich Sigismund Ormstein, Runo is able to figure out that there was a 4th hot air balloon in operation at the time of the incident, and that it was shot with a flaming arrow from the crossbow. He then suggests that Asman was never on stage but was killed by someone else beforehand and his body was placed inside the balloon. With no way to prove Hairbrain killed him, Runo's victory is all but secure.
Stop it. Get some help.
Hairbrain would rather be labeled a murderer than have his research exposed as a failure. Runo can't decide whether to pursue the truth, thus admitting his experiment was a failure, or uphold his promise and say his experiment was a success, thus making him guilty. But have no fear, for Susato is here. After a therapeutic reunion via Susato takedown, he sees reason and realizes it's more important for him to do his fucking job than pretend some mad science is actually real. The court is adjourned until the following day to locate Enoch Drebber, the engineer, magician, and swindler that built Hairbrain's machine. During this reunion between our two leads, and Iris, we finally learn how Susato knew about the unpublished Hound of the Baskervilles.
After all these years, finally.
She stumbled upon it in her father's office by total accident. Can you say letdown? Her father told her not to tell anyone about it for reasons we'll find out later. Ooh. Eventually they remember they have a man to find, and after talking with Hairbrain about Drebber, they visit Chief Justice Strongheart where they meet the coroner, Courtney Scythe, because apparently all women named Courtney are attractive. Look, I don't make the rules. Visiting Courtney's office reveals that the forensic investigation team has a real problem with losing things since they purchased 500 scalpels last month alone. That's 200 more scalpels than there were Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. Before Courtney's daughter Maria can put one of those scalpels to use on you and Susato, you hightail it out of there back to the Grand Exhibition where you meet Gina, now with the cutest dog ever. Still unable to investigate the machine, they put Toby on Enoch Drebber's tail by having him smell a business card of his that Hairbrain had. While Toby tracks a traitorous techie, our heroes once again encounter Van Zieks' apprentice, and Ryonosuke believes it to be Kazuma Asogi. Van Zieks doesn't know who that is, and says he became his apprentice 3 months ago when he arrived in England with complete amnesia, cause that's what you do with amnesiacs, make them prosecutor. Realizing if Kazuma really is alive that Herlock lied to them, they head back to the Wax Museum. Remember that place? Yeah, me neither. They find out the missing statue has been returned and see that the special exhibit shows off the night the professor supposedly rose from the dead only to be shot minutes later. They find a thick piece of glass on the headless homicider's person and notice that the man who witnessed his revival was Enoch Drebber, the very man they're looking for. Speaking of Drebber, Toby's located his factory. They eventually find him hiding in a safe since there's a time bomb in the room and he had no way to escape. He's also the one who stole the professor's statue, as proven by the masked head they find. The time bomb is disabled, but another one goes off, destroying Hairbrain's machine before anyone can investigate. Back in the trial, the main focus shifts to Drebber, Tuspels, and Scythe. Eventually, Ryonosuke is able to prove that Drebber masterminded the plan to kill Asman, hating him for not honoring his anonymity request when talking about the professor's revival, which ruined his reputation. And he had Courtney as his reluctant assistant, using his knowledge of her incorrect autopsy report of the professor as blackmail. The real Asman fell through a trap door in the floor where Courtney stabbed him with the screwdriver since he wasn't dead. She then moved the body to the other building and switched it out with the wax figure of the professor, which had fallen from the popped hot air balloon. What is it with fictional characters being way better criminals than 99% of real criminals? After Courtney and Drebber are arrested and Hairbrain is announced innocent, the prosecution and defense remain in the courtroom with the statue of the professor. The mask is removed to reveal...
Time for you to come face to face with this hideous monster. I borrowed the key for the mask from the proprietress of the Waxwork Museum. So see for yourselves now. Confirm it with your own eyes. The truth that's been hidden this past decade.
That's the professor?
Yes, that's him.
Until now, the thought never even crossed my mind. That the mass murderer, whose crimes shook Britain as never before.
Some Japanese man we've never seen before. Can you say letdown? Well, it's not a letdown for Van Ziek's masked friend. It seems to really upset him, actually.
Father.
What? Father? Kazuma!
Oh, look, Kazuma's still alive. I guess his life hasn't been a waste, huh? He recognizes the professor. In fact, it's his own father, Genshin Asogi. The reveal of Genshin's impact in Japan shoots us right into Chapter 4! Twisted Karma and his final bow! The chapter opens with Ryonosuke and Susato meeting Susato's father Yujin, the guy who likes to engage in some tomfoolery, and Seishiro Jigoku, who have arrived for the International Science Symposium. And damn, Judge, what junk you got in that trunk? Yujin tells them about how the two of them and Genshin traveled to Japan many years ago and had to keep what happened a secret to protect the Asogi name and English-Japanese relations. Back at 221B Baker Street, Sholmes has turned in two conmen to Inspector Lestrade after failing to reach Inspector Gregson. They then meet Sholmes' new client, Evie Vigil, who is looking for her husband, Daly, chief jailer at Barclay Prison. Herlock, having a disdain for missing persons cases, uses his dyed red hair as an excuse to pass the case to Ryonosuke and Susato. You just kinda have to accept that prosecutors and attorneys are basically also detectives in this world. After getting a letter from Yujin that convinces the chief prison officer Barry Caden to speak to them, they learn that Daly left his job a decade ago, having been fired after the professor incident. Returning to Sholmes' home, they encounter a distraught Gina who says something terrible happened, but I'm sure she's just overreacting.
Oh.
Yeah, they really did that. And to make matters worse, Van Zieks was arrested for it. After finding out that your former attorney friend is now your current prosecutor rival because he wants revenge against Van Zieks, who prosecuted his father, you manage to convince Van Zieks to let you defend him tomorrow. This trial is different from all the others. It's a closed trial. Since this case may very well expose the identity of the Reaper, Lord Chief Justice Strongheart ordered a closed trial to be observed by only other members of the judiciary. Van Zieks testifies that he was investigating Gregson for a confidential reason and didn't didn't see his body in the room until after he heard a gunshot, saw the door open, and heard a man scream. He also mentions that the gun at the scene was cold. Kazuma highlights an investigation board covering all the cases where someone Van Zieks failed to prosecute was murdered soon afterwards, and calls 3 witnesses to the stand. 3 street vendors, Venus, Gossip, and Sandwich. Huh. They look pretty irregular. I wonder if they hang around Baker Street. Gossip was the one that opened the door and screamed. He also fell over and placed his hand in a blood puddle. He says he wiped it on the floor, but Runo finds out he actually wiped it on the bulletin board, which was knocked over when he opened the door and exposed Gregson's body, thus explaining why Van Zieks didn't see it. After some casual perjury from Venus and retrieval of Gregson's watch she stole from the scene, Ryonosuke proposes that Gregson's time of death can't be verified, since the seemingly broken watch just failed to be wound, and a pack of Venus's fireworks could have been tied to the candle to create a makeshift time bomb and create the gunshot noise they heard. They then move on to the Red-Headed League, the group of cons that Herlock had arrested earlier. They were also being investigated by Gregson as evidenced by the red wig at the scene. They eventually confessed that someone presented Gregson's ID to them but looked nothing like the actual Inspector Gregson. They kidnapped him and locked him up in a room overnight. They also remember him being choked, resulting in a similar red ring to the short fat one, De Rossi. Ryonosuke recognizes the red ring, remembering it around Gossip's neck. The 2 cons recognize Gossip as Hugh Boone, owner of the room Gregson was found in. However, Hugh Boone is also a cover, for he is really Daily Vigil! Bet you forgot about that side plot. Daily reveals that Gregson found him a few years ago and would occasionally pay him to pretend to be Inspector Gregson and go places where he would be seen. It was good money, so Daily never questioned it. Daily then attempts to recall the day he lost his job at the prison, only to scream and faint. With that, the trial is suspended until tomorrow. After hearing Strongheart tell Kazuma to hurry up and convict Van Zieks already, they meet with Van Zieks, who tells them that the Reaper isn't a person, it's an organization. He then says Gregson was the inside man, providing them with information only Scotland Yard knew. He also reveals the name of one of the assassins, Aza Shin, the real name of Giselle Brett. So Wright in many memo is accidentally a hero. Finally, he shares a story of the night Genshin Asogi saved her from being killed. Wow, save a man only to kill his brother soon afterwards.
I'm gonna do what's called a pro gamer move.
Since we're in the land of bombshells now, why not throw in a few more? John Wilson was never Herlock Sholmes' partner and doesn't have a daughter? Of course! Yujin wants Ryonosuke to leave England, Susato and all of his other friends to come back to Japan? Sure! Someone helped Genshin escape from inside the prison and he wrote a last will and testament that we've never heard anything about? Why not? Barry Caden actually had the will the whole time and didn't think to mention it until just now? Makes sense to me. Someone took steps to cover up Gregson's real time of death and Strongheart told Maria not to include it in the autopsy report? Nothing fishy there. Yujin worked with Courtney and John on the autopsy of the professor? Nothing important, I'm sure. Said autopsy report is missing? Just misplaced, I'm sure. A chest belonging to Gregson is discovered containing a boat ticket for him and one guest, and the chest has a tip of a sword lodged in it. I don't know anyone with a sword. Ignore it. Iris stole the professor's autopsy report years ago because she realized the handwriting was a perfect match for her father's from his case notes, which is how she deduced that John Wilson is her father. Gotta love dead parents. The autopsy report was actually written by Yujin, who was really Herlock's assistant while he was in England and the real equivalent of John Watson in these games, thus implying that he's Iris' father. Gotta love alive parents. The chapter ends there before you actually solve anything. Wait, what? Chapter 5! The Resolve of Ryonosuke Naruhodo! It all comes down to this. One final sprint to figure out what really happened to Inspector Gregson and all their mysteries of the Reaper and the Professor. It's immediately obvious that there's more going on behind the scenes than they realize, as Lord Chief Justice Strongheart has taken over as judge. The first person to testify is Detective Inspector Gina Lestrade. Her testimony and subsequent cross-examination reveal that Gregson was on a ship called the Grouse the day before he died, and his target was Seishiro Jigoku. That's the Japanese judge. He was being targeted by the Reaper for being found not guilty after intimidating the jury by smashing the witness stand years ago. Ryonosuke is then able to take advantage of a slip from Kazuma and the tip of his sword lodged in Gregson's trunk to expose that Kazuma was the person accompanying Gregson on the boat. Tired of Gregson being treated like a criminal, Gina lashes out and Strongheart responds by saying she'll be stripped of her badge and never should have had it in the first place.
Now he's an evil fuck and I want to kick his ass.
ass.
He then calls a recess to make sure Seishiro is okay, and if he isn't located by tomorrow, they'll assume the worst. With help of a little plush made by Iris, Ryonosuke contacts Herlock, who happens to be on board the grouse with Yujin. Their investigation leads to them discovering Seishiro tucked within his own suitcase and a covered up bullet hole in the wall. Back home, they look at a telegram Herlock had asked Inspector Hosonaga to send earlier, and it contains 4 names. You actually see this exact thing at the end of the first game, but it wasn't at all important then, so I forgot about it. Oops! They then deduce that it is an assassin exchange between Japan and England. An English woman was sent to Japan to kill John Wilson so that she could be sent back to her own country and freed, and Kazuma's main intention for going to England in the first place was to kill Inspector Gregson. With Ryonosuke's family behind him, we head into the final battle. The first testimony is from Seishiro Jigoku himself, and it's a doozy. Thanks to some ace work from Ryonosuke, he exposes Seishiro as Gregson's real killer. He killed him in that cabin, put his body on ice until the ship departed, then hid it in his large suitcase. And you thought that was just a throwaway joke. He then brought it to the scene and set it up to make it look like he had died there and then. He explains that Ryonosuke taking Kazuma's spot messed up the assassin exchange, since it prevented him from sending another assassin in Kazuma's spot, so he had to wait for the right opportunity to go to England himself and do the job. However, he refuses to give up the English counterpart that forced him to do so before he is declared guilty and arrested. I mean, it should be pretty obvious. Luckily, the characters don't dance around the subject for hours. Kazuma reveals that he confronted Gregson on the boat and got him to confess that he faked the evidence in the autopsy report that led to his father's arrest. Realizing that Beric Van Zieks became prosecutor after the faked autopsy report, the real Reaper must be the person who is the lead prosecutor on the case beforehand, male Strongheart. Strongheart is about to end the trial before they can go any further, since it has no relation to the murder of Gregson, but the judiciary and a party-crashing Herlock ensure things continue. The only 2 people connected to the autopsy that can still appear are summoned next, Maria and Yujin. Maria presents the decisive evidence they found in Clint's stomach that led to Genshin's arrest. However, the ring was really sharp and would have left scratches in his throat which were not present. Yujin then mentions that all of the professor's other victims were killed by a dog, but Clint was stabbed with a sword. This leads them to question why Genshin accepted the charges if he was framed, to which Kazuma theorizes that a deal was struck to break him out of jail. This then leads to Barry Caden and Daily Vigil being called in to testify. Barry admits to there being a plan to break him out, and all he did was set it in motion while he gave most of the responsibility to Daily. When talking about the will Genshin wrote, Barry remembers the ink being blue, while Daily remembers it being red. Realizing that Clint's autopsy report noted the red ink stains on his hands, Ryonosuke comes to the conclusion that Genshin had Clint's will at some point, though it was never found. The fact that Clint had just written a will meant he knew he was going to die, which leads to Ryonosuke deducing that it was a confession and that Clint Van Zieks was the real Reaper. Genshin found out that Clint was the Reaper and confronted Strongheart about it, who refused to believe it. So Genshin does the only logical thing and kills Clint himself, but lets him write a will first since he's a respectful man. Strongheart, knowing what happened, knew he had to keep it a secret from the judiciary, so he got Gregson and Wilson to frame Genshin for the murders, which Genshin reluctantly agreed to, wanting to protect Kazuma. He'd be buried alive in his coffin, where they dig him up and send him back to Japan. Strongheart, having been exposed as the mastermind behind the framing of Genshin Asogi and the mastermind behind the Reaper, admits to it all. He says he used them to make people fear Beric and keep peace in London. The judiciary agrees with Strongheart's perspective of using darkness to protect the light. However, in his speech, he mentions Genshin's 3-page will, even though it only has 2 pages. The 3rd page is revealed to be a haiku that leads Ryonosuke to find Clint's will hidden within Kuruma, the sword passed down the Asogi line for generations. The will reveals that Clint only willingly killed the first victim of the professor. Someone found out what he did shortly after and began blackmailing him into killing targets of his choosing, including Clint's old mentor and former Chief Justice. This extortionist is, of course, current Chief Justice Strongheart. He claims the previous Chief Justice was too weak and tells the rest of his story. He got Seishiro to be a part of his plan after getting him off the hook in his own trial, and he was the one with him that night Genshin was supposed to be rescued. However, when Genshin was discovered by Enoch Drebber, Strongheart made Seishiro shoot Genshin dead. He then used that to blackmail Seishiro into the assassin exchange deal, which specifically targeted the Englishmen who knew about his plan, since he didn't want it getting out as he climbed the power rankings. rankings. Strongheart says he can't be tried for anything since he never did anything. He just convinced others to do things, all in the name of London's safety. The judiciary agrees and even begins chanting his name.
Man, 1910 times were scary!
However, another tug on the Hurlock hotline summons Hololock, a hologram of Hurlock, as he is currently at Buckingham Palace with the Queen, and he showed her the entire trial. Hollow Iris then arrives and has a message from the Queen saying Strongheart is stripped of all his power and will be tried in open court. Strongheart collapses and destroys like half the fucking courtroom. Jesus, dude, calm down. The OG judge then returns and finally announces that Van Zieks isn't guilty, even though we established that like hours ago. After the trial, Yujin reveals one final twist to Ryonosuke, Susato, Van Zieks, and Kazuma. Genshin gave him an address to go to help a pregnant woman, said woman being Clint's pregnant wife, Miss Baskerville. Yujin helped deliver the baby, but couldn't return to Japan with her, so he put her in the care of Hurlock Sholmes and named her Iris, the English translation of his deceased wife's name. So yes, Beric Van Zieks is actually Iris's uncle, which is a family reunion I desperately want to see. Speaking of family reunions, that's exactly what we get with a Baker Street house party! Gina plans on going back to being a pickpocket, but they manage to convince her to carry on the legacy of Gregson. Iris gives up trying to find out about her father, understanding that Hurlock is her father now and the only one that matters. After the party, Susato goes off somewhere, and Ryonosuke tells Yujin that he's decided to go back to Japan. He explains that he was never supposed to be here, and that Susato was never supposed to be his assistant. And now that Kazuma is in England, he can be the attorney he was meant to be with Susato at his side, leaving no room for Ryonosuke. Susato, having overheard the entire conversation, said she knew what choice he was going to make. At the day of Ryonosuke's departure, Kazuma, Susato, Hurlock, and Iris are there to see him off. Kazuma gives Kuruma to Ryonosuke, saying he's not worthy of it yet after wanting to kill Gregson. He then reveals that he supports the ship, and I'm not talking about the boat he's about to leave on. When Susato left the other night, she went to Kazuma to ask for his approval to travel back to Japan at Ryonosuke's side. He accepts, saying he knows that's what Ryonosuke wants, even if he's too respectful to admit it. The game ends with our two heroes of ship setting sail, literally and figuratively. This game is great. I guess that's what happens when you create a whole game to essentially do nothing but set up another game. If I was writing this game, I would have combined chapters 1 and 2. Have it take place from Ryonosuke's perspective during Susato's absence and have him reflect on the case notes of the events of chapter 2, but change it so that Susato had to be the attorney in that case after Ryonosuke got sick. It's early 20th century London, it's not exactly clean. This way, we get the tutorial / refresher chapter done in a more natural way by having a different character have to learn how things are done, and we don't have to wait until chapter 3 for things to really get going. And that's really my only problem with this game. Chapters 3 through 5 tell this interesting and interwoven storyline, while chapters 1 and 2 are disjointed and standalone. The characters continue to be the standouts, with the relationship and back and forth between Ryonosuke and Susato being the highlight of the game. Hurlock and Iris are a lot better in this game as well, and I liked Gina's turnaround from thief to detective. It's my favorite adaptation of all the Sherlock Holmes characters used in these games. The plot twist that John Wilson wasn't this game's John Watson felt like a plot twist for plot twist's sake, since all it does is introduce the possibility that Susato and Iris are related, which doesn't even end up being true, so what was the point? Aside from that, the story and cases are very strong, and there aren't many leaps in logic that have to be made, which can't be said for everything in the Ace Attorney series. The Great Ace Attorney 2 Resolve gets an 8.5 out of 10. It's 3/5 a great game and 2/5 a good game. And next time we'll travel back to the future and become the proud new owner of a restaurant where absolutely nothing will go wrong. I hope to see you there.